It's a real pleasure to be invited here today, and this is a really sort of key moment in terms of the agenda of sustainability and how it relates and interrelates with health. So, is green the new blue is the sort of challenge, and I hope by the end of this presentation you may sort of start to sort of see that it maybe is. So I'm going to go through some of the ways in which this agenda intersects and the way it's becoming more embedded and how it might be relevant corporately, hopefully in terms of your teaching, but also in terms of your practice as clinicians. So just to give a bit of background, who's heard of the Sustainable Development Unit? Is anybody? Excellent, that's really good. That's a good start. You can all put your hands up at the end of this session. So the Sustainable Development Unit was it's funded and accountable to NHS England and Improvement and Public Health England. We are hosted within the strategy group, within the Strategy and Innovation Directorate of NHS England and Improvement. And we've been around for about 10 years. So we are a very small team. For 10 years, there's been 7 of us within the whole NHS, centrally devoted to driving forward the agenda of sustainable development, and also in terms of the challenge that was laid out in 2008 with regards to the Climate Change Act. So many of you would have probably been aware that the UK was the first nation globally to adopt a legally binding position in terms of reducing our carbon emissions. Actually, the UK was the first nation globally to calculate the carbon impacts of its health and care system, of its NHS in particular. So in 2008, the SDU led on that piece of work, and we still are seen as a world leader in terms of owning and addressing our carbon impacts across our health and care system. So we were set up to support the NHS to fulfil its potential and to lead in the UK and globally in terms of addressing our carbon impacts. Of course, sustainable development is far broader than carbon, and we've always been called the Sustainable Development Unit, so I'll pick up on some wider issues as we go through. Some stats I am sure you're aware of. The NHS is vast. It provides over 20 million mental health provides for over 20 million mental health service users each year, 5 million consultations, 1 million patients, and all the other stats. The NHS is huge. So in terms of our scale, we also have a huge environmental impact and a huge social impact. While we're aware of the size of the NHS, often the scale of our impact is not quite so clear. So to deliver all of those outcomes, or those outputs, we have a carbon footprint of 21.4 million tonnes. To put that in context, that's the carbon footprint of a not very small country, just for the NHS. And if we consider the size of the NHS, we're roughly 10% of GDP. Maybe that isn't surprising, given that the UK is one of the largest economies in the world. But if you look at the impact those carbon emissions have, so you can quantify the cost to society from those carbon emissions, the cost to society from the impacts of climate change, from those carbon emissions, is about £2 billion in terms of damage each year. So that's using the government's, the Treasury's Green Book to sort of do that conversion. So delivering of health and care, we drive 9.5 billion miles every year, or what 9.5 billion road miles are driven each year through the delivery of health and care. So it's the movement of patients and visitors, the movement of staff, staff commuting. The overall impact is that many road miles. And if you turn that into impacts in terms of air pollution, of course, the impacts are potentially staggering. So, the impact of those road miles, the air pollution resulting from those road miles, costs society about £6.9 million every week, treating the onus that arises from the impact of the road miles that are delivered to drive NHS staff around and patients around. So, there's an obvious connection here that we need to start considering. How do we reduce the health impacts from the way in which we deliver health and care? In terms of waste, we produce 11.3 tonnes of waste. 11,300 tonnes of waste a day, and given the types of waste we produce, the percentage of that waste which is plastic is actually a lot higher than most other industries. And I think anybody who's looked at NHS waste bins and recycling bins will have seen the majority or a good proportion of that waste is actually plastics. And if we're looking society-wide at how we address single-use plastics, the NHS has a particular role to play in that endeavour. And some of the irony, particularly if we look at air pollution impacts, is that our impacts are often concentrated closest to where health is the poorest. So if we are delivering most of our care in areas of already high health inequalities and air pollution is being released in those areas, then we may well be contributing to health inequalities. There's an argument. So over the last few years, we are still, as I say, viewed as a world leader. We have reduced our carbon footprint across the NHS by 18.5%, which is pretty good, since 2007. However, healthcare activity over the same period has increased by some measures by about 27%. So, with increasing demand, we've still managed to drive down our footprint. We've reduced our water footprint. We've put in place a requirement that NHS organisations have to have sustainable development management plans and are required to report each year on progress. So that's embedded into NHS contracts, constitution, and a lot of the progress, it's fair to say, though, over the last few years has been around energy efficiency, around waste efficiency, around transport efficiency. But we're getting to the point where actually that isn't enough. We've made some of those big savings, those big cost savings and carbon savings, but actually we're now starting to think, needing to start to think, actually, how do we embed this into the way in which we design and deliver health and care? How does this become core to the way in which we develop and specify health care? So, it is fair to say, I think over the last 10 years, a lot of this has been focused on, as I say, estates. A lot of it has been focused on the low-hanging fruit. And actually, in terms of embedding this into the way we develop and deliver health and care, there's been footsteps in that direction, but it hasn't been embedded fully. But actually, if you look at the long-term plan, in the last 6 months, the orientation around this agenda has changed dramatically. Obviously, socially or society-wide, there's a greater focus and expectation on the way in which we deliver everything as a society in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of sustainability. And the NHS, clearly, as such a large part of our economy, has a really key part to play in that. And with the long-term plan, for the first time, these commitments around carbon emissions reduction, around air pollution reduction, around plastics, around waste, around water, are now embedded into core NHS strategy with specific measurable targets attached to them. Anybody who's been involved in developing strategic documents like this know that every single word is worked very hard over and has weight behind it. So the lines in the NHS long-term plan, which I'll go through in a second, really have got a lot of weight and a lot of investment of energy and commitment behind them. And this guiding document should be that sort of starting point that actually gets us all thinking about how do we deliver this at a local level? What does this mean for my practice? What does this mean for my teaching? What does this mean within my organisation? Because the next steps from this, through the local implementation frameworks and the way in which we develop the implications through our local systems, give us a huge opportunity to move beyond the low-hanging fruit in terms of embedding sustainability into the way in which the health and care system works. So this has got, obviously approval right from the top. Climate change is a health emergency, Simon Stephen announced at Expo 19. So that's a pretty clear statement. There's a need for the NHS to be the change it wants to see. Those sorts of statements are the approach in the statements that we're now seeing from top leadership. So just to tease out some of the specific lines. So on air pollution, I've sort of stated the issues, but actually what are we committed to do? So the long-term plan commits us to a number of specific targets. One is that by 2023-24, we'll cut business mileage and fleet air pollution by 20%. There are also commitments to move to ultra-low emissions and low-emission vehicles. 90% of our fleet will be low-emission vehicles by 2028. So reducing the emissions from our fleet and the way in which we develop and deliver services, so for example, reducing outpatient appointments by a third, all of these things contribute to reducing our air pollution. We can't do it alone, of course. We have to work with local government and our public health colleagues to deliver this. The long-term plan commitments on carbon, waste and water, and carbon particularly, we've committed to reduce our carbon footprint by 51% against in line with the Climate Change Act targets. So that means, of course, more greening of our estate, less coal and oil fuel used within the health sector estate. And to be honest, using coal and oil fuel, like burning diesel in vehicles, is not great for air pollution. So there's a good reason to do that. Also, some specific focus, which, as was mentioned, I had the pleasure of leading on within the NHS England on things like greener inhalers, reducing the carbon impact of asthma inhalers and the carbon impacts of anaesthetic gases. So, out of interest, how many people in this room work in respiratory-based areas? There's a few. And how many work in anaesthesia-based areas? There's a few more. So there's a couple of slides here that are going to be particularly useful, I think, to you. So the plastics point, there's not a specific target here, but we have committed to reducing single-use plastics throughout the NHS supply chain. So there's a number of routes to that, and a number of enablers, of course. So first of all, in terms of the corporate approach, has anybody in this room seen whether their organisation has something called a Sustainable Development Management Plan? Well, that's a good start. One.
Colleagues asked for it and we haven't got to say it.
Okay. So it's well worth asking then, asking within your organisation where the SDMP is and whether you can see it. Because that is a requirement of the NHS standard contract. And we are pushing on the need for organisations to have these in place. And they are the focus documents for how organisations are delivering on these sorts of expectations and the requirements in the long-term plan. So the SDU publishes the guidance on how to produce these things. It's quite broad, but that's certainly a core document. It's worth asking to see. And from your clinical specialisms, to ask whether this covers things like respiratory care or anaesthesia or the design of services or the training of staff. And on staff, it's also worth bearing in mind that actually we ran a survey back in 2017 to try and ascertain the level of staff will and enthusiasm for this sort of agenda before going through the NHS long-term plan. We were shocked to get 6,500 responses to the survey. We thought we were going to get a couple of hundred. We had a huge response from NHS staff wanting to tell us how important they thought environmental sustainability was to them in their workplace. So 98% of NHS staff who responded said that they thought that it was important for the health and care system to support the environment, which is great. It's always quite nerve-wracking when you run one of these things. You don't know what's going to come back exactly. But actually, there was a huge support there. But only 71% of staff felt that their employer encouraged them to support the environment at work. So there's a values to actions gap there. Within our workplaces, how can we address that? But it does give us a mandate, an absolutely cast iron mandate to act. And of course, to put this in context, all the points that we've made earlier, health care is only one part of the vast picture. Most of the picture in terms of health and care is around prevention and management and reducing the need for the health and care system. And the most efficient way to run a health and care system is to make sure that people don't get sick in the first place. So if we can weave this as an aspect of quality into the way in which we develop and deliver health and care systems, we generate less ill health that we have to treat later. So this is about efficient, high-quality health and care. Just to focus on the carbon piece for a minute, often there's a point made that there's only so much we can do. There's a lot of this challenge, which is somebody else's problem. What's China doing, for example, is usually the answer, the question. And that's absolutely true. If you look at the wedges here, that we've calculated where elements of carbon challenge sits. All the purple are the things that we can't really influence directly. So that's, national grid, international supply chain, vehicle efficiency. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that has to be done by others, but all the green underneath are things that we can directly influence, and we must directly influence if we're going to achieve the targets in terms of meeting our Climate Change Act commitments. So reducing the carbon impact of anesthetic gases, inhalers, design of models of care, more focus on public health and prevention. And then there's a gap, which we are not sure about how we're going to deliver as yet. And I think this is common in most forward scenarios. Actually identifying what we don't know is also critically important. And some of that may well be offsetting. It may well be things like tree planting, netting off, as it's called technically in the government reports for net zero. But there is we are starting to map out how our trajectory to the future is going to work. On plastics, we've quantified where our impacts are. So we now know from that list, you can see where are our biggest plastics impacts. And you can see from the couple of things at the top, like examination gloves, disposable wipes, single-use theatre protective clothing, those are where our biggest single-use plastic impacts are. So thinking about where in our practice we might be able to start reducing some of the use of these products where clinically appropriate, gives us a way in to actually start to reduce some of our impact on single-use plastics. Simple things like catering products and tableware. So is our organisation committed to meeting the government's commitments around reducing things like plastic straws where appropriate, and stirrers and cups and that sort of thing? We can ask those questions within our organisations. Is there a commitment there? Is there a plan? And that's a direct quote from the long-term plan, delivering improvements, including reductions in single-use plastics throughout the NHS supply chain. One point which was worth maybe highlighting is, has anybody heard of the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing Gloves campaign? Yeah, a couple? I mean, it's a fantastic campaign. The RCN has identified there's potential co-benefits from working to appropriately reduce glove use. In terms of occupational health, there are issues around contact dermatitis. In terms of patient contact, there may be benefits in terms of actually more contact with patients rather than less. And in a lot of cases, they've identified opportunities to reduce glove use for the benefit of the workforce and the benefit of patients. But it's worth having a look at that campaign. They've got some great materials and seeing if it's relevant to your organisation. It's not an NHS England campaign, but it's one that's worth exploring and thinking about how might we replicate that sort of approach in other areas. Obviously, the point in terms of the impacts of air pollution we've made already, but it's got impacts across pregnancy, children, adults, and the elderly. It impacts across every aspect of our lives. But actually, in terms of opportunities to reduce that impact, again, directly from the long-term plan, redesigned care and greater use of virtual appointments will also reduce the need for patient and staff travel, and the NHS will work to reduce air pollution from all sources. So how do we do that at a local level? Are we asking those questions within our own practice about how can we reduce the movement of vehicles or improve the vehicles that are used? In terms of delivery of services, can we encourage greater walking or public transport, digital consultations, that sort of thing? I'm going to come on to my favourite couple of slides because these are the areas that I lead directly on. So just, I'm not keeping an eye on the time, but just tell me, give me a wave. So in terms of metered dose inhalers, you may or may not be aware of this impact. This is the carbon footprint of every nation on Earth on a hockey stick. Obviously, China and Brazil and the US are at this end. And if you look at if you look at this end, the green dot, number 4, is the carbon footprint of England. If you look at the red dot, the red dot is the carbon footprint, let's get this right, of the NHS in England. The yellow dot at the far end is the carbon footprint of metered dose inhaler use in England only, on the scale of nations. So the propellant that are used in metered dose inhalers, the fluorinated gases that are used as propellants, are very potent greenhouse gases. So through the use of those metered dose inhalers, we are releasing those fluorinated gases into the atmosphere. And there are ways of addressing this. In fact, if you look at the sort of pink dot, that's the impact of metered dose inhalers worldwide. So that's the footprint of Latvia, just about. So this is specifically identified as an area of focus within the long-term plan, that shift to lower carbon inhalers. And it's not just about lower carbon inhalers, it may also be around ensuring that used inhalers are returned to pharmacies and disposed of in medicines waste or recycling bins. Because actually most inhalers have about 20% of the propellant left in them at the end of their useful life. So there are lower carbon alternatives. So NICE, we work with NICE to produce a patient decision aid, which can be used by GPs, potentially by pharmacists. It's intended for use between GPs and patients to look at the options in the whole around which type of inhaler might be suitable, but it also covers off that aspect of potentially patient value. Do you value the environmental impact of your inhaler? And if you do, if you'd rather go for a lower carbon inhaler, if it's appropriate, you might want to look at a smooth mist inhaler or a dry powder inhaler. So actually placing that information in the right place at the right time and giving people options that reflect and respect their values, in this case, can actually go hand in hand with reducing quite a significant proportion of the NHS carbon footprint. So how might we embed that into our training? Are clinicians aware? Are our colleagues aware of these impacts? Are there opportunities to embed this into the way in which we have that sort of dialogue where we deliver training or we deliver our practice? Likewise, BTS has produced guidelines that highlight all of these impacts as well. So these links are live links. You can click through and look at the BTS guidelines, the lines that say what we should be doing to reduce this impact. So similarly, anaesthetics. The inhaler carbon footprint is about 850,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year. The impact of our anaesthetics is about 500,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. About 20% of that is from desflurane only, and the rest, well, 70% from desflurane. Most of the rest is from nitrous oxide. Interestingly, desflurane and sevoflurane, I'm reliably informed, I'm not a clinician, I have to say, but I'm reliably informed by members of the working group, are often interchangeable. Sevoflurane has a vastly lower carbon impact than desflurane, and it's very easy to swap between the two. In fact, apparently sevoflurane is slightly cheaper than desflurane as well. So if we're aware of those impacts and the potential to change between the two, are there opportunities for us to make that change? And are we making trainee anaesthetists aware of these opportunities to change their practice and deliver environmental co-benefits as well? We're currently working on the ways in which you might reduce the amount of nitrous oxide getting out into the atmosphere as well. Because nitrous oxide is not such a potent greenhouse gas, but we release an awful lot of it. So in maternity wards, maybe there's opportunities with better air scrubbing. There might be opportunities to provide this information appropriately in birth planning, if mothers to be wish to opt to use less nitrous, or for water birthing, or for other alternatives. There may be other alternatives for anaesthesia other than use of nitrous oxide, which we're trying to explore as options at the moment, but we don't know all the answers. And actually asking the question as widely as possible so that somebody out there comes back with some of the great answers, I think is part of the value of being able to stand in front of you today. I think you're the experts in your areas of work. So, but how do we weave these sort of considerations into the way in which we design services requiring these products? So we've got a lot to do. I mean, that's the sort of chart of what we're going to have to achieve to meet the long-term plan targets. We're going to have to dramatically start changing our use of anaesthetic gases. I think I've covered that one. So just winding up, in terms of this work, obviously there are things we can do, but there are things we're going to have to do in terms of working with industry as well. We have identified where our carbon hotspots are in terms of the drugs, the products, the things which are the biggest impacts in terms of carbon impacts. I mean, this list is from a published report that we have on our website, and obviously it covers some of the respiratory medicines which we've already talked about, but there's a whole host of products on there which we've already identified as high contributors to our carbon impact through our supply chain. And interestingly, NICE as well as recently, this is a quote from Jill Lang, NICE from a recent BMJ article. So NICE have stated, for NICE, the goal is to routinely consider environmental factors in the development of clinical guidelines and the appraisal of new drugs and technologies. So, again, from senior leadership across the health and care system, the commitment to act is absolutely there. But, a lot of this is going to require support from those who are delivering in terms of, knowing where to act and how we can act, and advising the sorts of alternatives and appropriate approaches. So the next phase, obviously sustainable clinical practice. How do we embed this thinking into the way in which you develop clinical practice? We don't have all the answers. We need to have others to come to us with the answers, from NHS England's point of view. Obviously, in terms of things like air pollution and waste, there's a huge amount of work to do in terms of partnership with local government. So the SDU has been 7 people for 10 years. We're now growing to a team of about 14 people. And a lot of that is around how we cascade this down to a local level, how we work in partnerships particularly with local governments and other agencies at a local level. And those partnerships with industry, of course, as well, in terms of developing the solutions. So we have to have the alternative products out there that actually have a lower impact. And of course, holding ourselves to account. So that question about sustainable development management plans and what's your organisation doing, we all need to look to our own organisations and look at what we're doing, holding ourselves to account. So hopefully these are some thoughts to take away. What opportunities are there in our own teaching and clinical practice? Hopefully I've given you a few little hints and some pointers to the absolute commitment to this from the NHS England improvement. But it's up to you to come, as I say, to come back to us with how you might embed this into teaching or clinical practice. And those sorts of challenges around asking our organisations how this fits into a whole organisational approach. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerome, for a really interesting talk. We've got 5 minutes, so we've got time for a few questions. But first of all, I'd just like to say, Jerome said there's 7 people working at the Sustainability Development Unit. They're going up to 14. Well, we in HE have 7,000 trainees and 4,500 trainers. So, we need your advice, but we need to be delivering it because we're the scale that it can be delivered on. So, I really appreciate that you came today. I'm sure you'll have some questions. So, any questions from the floor? Yeah. Just get your mic. There's a microphone just behind you.
You focused on the anesthetic gases and things like that. So, just thinking on the specifics of that, if you replace that with propofol, you'll be using tons of plastic in the form of syringes. So which is the lesser evil? Yeah, because at low flows, the gases you're talking about are order of parts per million. Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but very small amounts. Whereas it's plastic. Yeah, so the carbon footprint needs to be considered, and the plastic needs to be considered rather than any quick fix solution.
That's a very good point. I think in any change to an alternative, there are always trade-offs, and knowing what the impacts of the alternatives are versus the impacts of the current state of affairs is absolutely critical. I think you can identify places where there's a minimal impact in terms of trade-off. So desflurane to sevoflurane, there shouldn't be any other. I'm very happy to be proved otherwise, but there shouldn't be any other impacts. But absolutely, I think often, another. If we look at water birthing, for example, there's the cost of heating the water, potentially the plastic disposable liners, those sorts of impacts that have to be quantified. But yeah, that's a good point.
Question? Have we got a microphone? Yeah.
Just asking a question about sustainable energy in the NHS. And new hospitals, and we built a new elective care centre about 10, 15 years ago with no prospect of PV cells or water heating facilities, and most of the hospitals I see being built don't have them. Is there an initiative to do that, to think about photovoltaic cells or
Yeah, yes, it's very true. It's a good point. I think, back in 2008, we had a brief, I say brief, a couple of year window where energy prices went like that, available public money went like that, and actually, there was quite a lot of investment in energy efficiency, and then we had the feed-in tariffs, so we had, an amount of investment in renewable energy. There is now a team within NHS Estates focused on sustainability, which is great, and they are working on the sorts of solutions that we can put in place around, after the easy energy efficiency stuff. So this £46 million has been already earmarked to spend on a switch to LED lighting, retrofitting LED lighting into all hospitals and NHS facilities. So that's a great start. I mean, that will save about 33,000 tonnes of CO2 a year. But actually, you're right, in terms of the design of new buildings, not just the design for carbon emissions reduction, but also the design for future climate. How do we embed those into the considerations? And there is thinking along those lines and about how we do that. I can't give you a more specific answer than that. Yeah.
Got time for one more question?
Hi, I just want to ask, are you going to be using your influence to ask external regulators such as the CQC, the GMC, to actually put pressure on trusts by having benchmark for sustainability within in inspections?
That's a very good question. I think, in terms of sustainability as an aspect of quality, I can't speak for the CQC. In terms of how likely this is to get embedded into their, obviously they're very hard pressed with a lot of balance of difficult priorities to meet. I mean, I think in terms of the expectations from NHS England as a regulator, they're clearly laid out in the long-term plan. That sort of forward approach. Where there are elements that intersect directly with health, there's going to be obviously more interest in how that links neatly. But I can't speak for the CQC at this point. Yes.
Well, just one last question.
About the quality of service, is it going to stay as good as it is? But that way you're not going to drive the quality of service down in a way of preventing infection, aseptic technique, or producing a drugs or medication which is lower quality just for sake of getting to the target. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's the important thing.
That's very true. I think, obviously the first consideration in every element of this is patient care and quality of service. So, in terms of some of the examples we've given, there isn't that trade-off. So things like the options around inhalers, for example, they're both recognised as valid and appropriate options. All of the work sits within the boundaries of NICE and BTS guidelines. It's just about making sure that there's a clear awareness of the choice and the options that are available. I think finding those opportunities first is absolutely the way forward. I think as time goes on, ensuring that we get the right level of value attributed to these sorts of impacts is important, but always, I'm sure it'll be patient and quality that comes first.
Thank you very much, Jerome.
Thank you.